So, Shirley Jackson is an absolute master at creating sinister tension through a mask of absolute mundane, ordinary life. And her second novel, and my favorite novel, Hangsaman, is absolutely no exception. I've probably read this book, and I'm not to be hyperbolic, but I've probably read it 500 times. And every time I read it, I am still consistently perplexed at her ability to make the most unnerving story through what is honestly very mundane events. And the last time I was rereading this, I was trying to figure out what would I call this even just from a genre perspective. And I figure it's somewhere between being a coming of age story, given how it's watching our 17-year-old protagonist journey into college and finding herself, once she has that independence. Or maybe this is more like a character study in mental deterioration as her delusions become increasingly vivid and the daydreams that that we see from almost page one just become increasingly indistinguishable from her reality. But as I contemplated those two choices, I wound up deciding that I think this is actually more like a reverse Bildungsroman, watching the psychological deterioration of our protagonist as she eases into adulthood. Now, Bildungsromans are like, the classic example would be Jane Eyre. It's kind of like a fancier way of saying coming of age. It's watching the spiritual or moral growth of a character. As I said, we do not get to see her grow. We see Natalie deteriorate and become stagnant and become ultimately a more definitive version of who she was on page one. The story, as I said, it's a very weird story because it kind of just meanders a lot, yet it doesn't feel like it's dragging. On the contrary, it feels often like it's unraveling without ever going anywhere. It's like, imagine having like a spool of yarn and you're just watching it unravel until there is nothing left. So my first instinct was to say that Shirley Jackson accomplished this through the magic that is Shirley Jackson. But upon closer inspection, I figured it's not actually magic. You can pinpoint how she is doing this. And she is creating this through giving this mundane plot a very sinister atmosphere. Like, as I said, the story is, bare bones. The story is a young girl, goes to college, finds herself. But her world exists in this dense atmosphere of isolation. Natalie is lonely and sheltered and trying to find her way in this incredibly unwelcoming world. And, in this house, we love Shirley Jackson. We love her skills, and we love the fact that she is a master at creating tension with the dark twists on the ordinary. This book is no exception. From the beginning pages, Natalie is always shown daydreaming. This initially seems to set up that she has a creative mind until her daydreams turn on her very quickly. It's always an accusatory voice questioning her about an alibi and demanding she account for herself. That she has to defend herself to this voice. And she is not fazed by this twist. Readers are the ones who are fazed by it because none of us were expecting it, but Natalie expects it because it's Natalie's daydream. Or if she doesn't expect it because she has control over it, she expects it because she is a character who expects no less. She always needs to defend herself. She imagines this detective asking her, well, how do you account for the gap between your visit to the rose garden and your discovery of the body? And, it's jarring to us that it's suddenly realizing her daydreams are involving defending herself against a murder accusation, but not really her. Most of the daydreams frequently include this detective who's always accusing her, and these daydreams come on very compulsively, suggesting it's more of a habit. The first time she has it, she's sitting down at breakfast with her family. There's no connection between the accusing voices and herself, though it's more like, at first it begins like it's just a daydream, it's devoid of reality. But then let's go several chapters later when she is at college and the girls ask her if she's a virgin. And she says, "I won't answer," which is the exact retort she always gives the imaginary detective. This shows that internally and externally, Natalie always believes she is being interrogated, scrutinized, and judged. This isolates her from the surroundings, leaving her closed off from everyone around her. And what people she does have a relationship with, it is often very unnervingly written. For instance, her relationship with her father is tinged with these very sinister undertones. Her father is a very accomplished writer, and he props up Natalie to a degree as a gifted writer, but he also has this sort of need for control over her and control over who she sees and has connections with. Connections need to exist through him. He will belittle Natalie's mother right to her, kind of, creating this idea that she shouldn't go to her mother, that she should look down on her mother, and that isolates her from this household. And as I said, he has this sort of pride in her, but it's incredibly possessive. He presents like his pride in her writing as a father tending to his daughter's writing habits, but the way he talks to her is often wrought with this sexual implication. And it's a very odd type of sexual, because it's not necessarily like you think something is going to happen or that it's even ramping up to like bad touch or anything, but it's just a little bit odd. Like when she's away in college, he writes to her, "My dear captive princess, it is as much as any knight can do these days to keep in touch with his captive princesses." And then Natalie just, we as the readers are a bit disturbed, but she doesn't care. She writes back, "Well, dear Sir Knight, it was not you then caroling lustily under my window these 3 nights past?" So it's odd. They just kind of dance around this idea that there's something sexual between them, but they don't come out to say anything. And that leaves the reader constantly holding their breath for a revelation that is never going to come. And Natalie, and that's not to say that like there's no other mention of sexual trauma, because there actually is implied sexual trauma that triggers Natalie's increasingly psychological breaks. Natalie is at a party, and she's at a party, a family party, before she goes away to college, and one of her father's friends pulls her aside, and it is implied that he sexually assaulted her in the woods. But we do not see this happen. Instead, we jump over it. The last thing we have her saying is, "Oh dear God, is he going to touch me?" And then it jumps over. And it's the next morning, and Natalie wakes up filled with shame, crying, like whimpering, "No, please no," before insisting to herself, "Nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened. I don't remember. I will not think about it." But she forces herself to repress this memory, believing that it doesn't matter. And she says, "I'll remember it 60 years from now, maybe, when I'm an old woman, and I'll think, oh, how sad that was, but I will not think about it now. It did not happen." And it's kind of like, if she's convinced herself, if I don't acknowledge that it happened, it didn't happen. And she goes downstairs, and she does say she has an erring body and a bruised face, and nobody in the family comments on it. Her father wishes her a good morning, and readers, perhaps recalling that it was her father's friend who assaulted her, cringe. at the fact that this is the first interaction she has. Natalie wishes everyone else a good morning, inwardly thinking, if she spoke, she would tell them what happened, not because she had much desire to tell, but because this was not a personal manifestation, but had changed them all and changing the world in a sense that they only existed in Natalie's imagination. The thought is long, and it is exhausting, and it is filled with interjections and confusion. It's the mind of somebody who is absolutely falling apart. But, as I said, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. I will not think about it. And she doesn't. Except, interestingly, she won't answer whether or not she's a virgin. But other than that, she does not think about it, not directly at least. And now, the only times it really comes up again is in this sort of very, like, vaguely tugging way towards the end of the book, when she finally has her complete break from reality. That's when she runs off with her friend Tony. Tony is I could dedicate a whole video to whether or not Tony is real, because there is some thought that Tony is actually just part of her imagination. Perhaps Tony is real. She appears in the third act seemingly out of nowhere, and yet it does not feel forced. It's really magical. We don't really see Tony ever interact with other characters, which is why a lot of people believe Tony isn't real. And Tony and Natalie have this kind of vaguely sapphic relationship. They spend the night together, they shower together, then they decide to skip school and run away together. They ride the bus to the woods, and the woods, setting-wise, triggers readers and, in a way, Natalie to when she was assaulted in the woods. Now, I say in a way Natalie because she does not make the direct connection, but she instead begins to believe Tony is trying to kill her. Out of nowhere, she thinks this. And when this is coupled with the violence Natalie experienced from the party and her obsessive thoughts over death, Jackson has just effectively groomed readers to expect the worst. Like, they don't know what's going to happen next. However, it's worth noting that it's not written as though Tony is going to kill her. It's actually, in fact, written that Tony is pleading with her to escape together. However, Natalie leaves, and Natalie walks away from a chance to move away from everything else, to escape, and to start anew with somebody who genuinely cared about her. So she runs away, and she's picked up by a couple who are worrying about the dangers of a woman walking out along the trails out of town at night. Even when she's safe, Shirley Jackson just preoccupies with readers with this idea of what could happen. What violence could you be met with? Either way, Natalie is dropped off at her school, and she looks at the campus, and she smiles, and there's that very famous final line, as she had never been before. She was now alone and grown up and powerful and not at all afraid. Yet, even though there's this declaration of growth, there is something that rings very hollow about this proclamation, because Natalie has abandoned the friend she had. She's abandoned the possibilities of something better. And she's returned to this hostile campus with no sense of closure or growth or even the understanding that she is as damaged as she is. By the last page, as I said, she's not grown. She is a definitive version of who she was from page 1. She is lonely, she is sheltered, and she's returning to this place that is very hostile to her. She exists in denial, she exists surrounded by misery, and she is okay with that in the end. And it's a very strange and dark book. It's supposedly loosely based on the disappearance of a Bennington College sophomore in 1946. Some debate about that, because apparently Shirley Jackson has gone on the record to say it was not based on that. I have a feeling of believing her because in so many ways, Natalie feels like a very personal, it feels like Natalie is based on her in a lot of ways, or based on this alternate version of her. Because there's something about Natalie that is incredibly, there's this restless darkness to her that surrounds her, and you could almost see it as like, what would I, Shirley Jackson, have been like had I gone to college, but had I completely fallen, like have I completely succumbed to my mental state. And that's another thing. The perspective of this book is quite interesting when you consider Natalie's tendency to daydream. It's the last thing I want to touch on before I hop out of here. This book is written in third person. However, I was kind of beginning to wonder the other day if it's not actually first person. And that's going to sound confusing. So give me a second. Okay, it's written with she, her, they, them, always a third person limited protagonist. However, I was wondering if perhaps, and because of the fact that it's third person limited, you do get some insight into Natalie's thoughts, but there's a barrier between you as the reader and Natalie as the character, which again also does contribute to this feeling of this unnerving feeling, because the character you are not totally with her. You do not totally understand everything that is happening. There is always that barrier. However, I was wondering more recently, what if that is how Natalie views herself? But this is first person, but Natalie genuinely does view herself in third person, and that Natalie does view herself with that sense of this remoteness. And I only wondered that because Natalie is a writer, and Natalie is a creative type, and Natalie daydreams a lot. And it did make me wonder, how does Natalie actually think in the moment-to-moment action? And is it possible that Natalie is that detached? Because Natalie is often detached from things that are happening to her and around her, and immediately following something, she detaches right away. And that was something I was considering. I don't have any definitive answer on that. I might make some more videos talking about Hangsaman because I do have a lot more to say about it. But I'm going to close off around here. I'm not going to say when I'm going to make the next video because we've already accepted that I don't make them on the schedule that I say I will. So with that being said, goodbye.